Hey everybody, happy Tuesday. I wanted to make a quick video here before the Last of Us drops. I don't know if I want to say feasting on those episodes, but it's a pretty awesome show, so I gotta make this quick. And I keep trying to fit too much in this video. There was a really interesting interview with Ben Hodges, General Ben Hodges, who was the former commander of U.S. forces in Europe, and also does a great Foghorn Leghorn impersonation, except focused on international relations and military spending and things like that. I'd really recommend checking him out. He was on DW News out of Germany, and did a really interesting interview. Hit a lot of interesting points. I may actually make a few more responses or sort of replies to that conversation. But maybe the most interesting point that he made, or I don't know, sort of made, was talking about how continually we are sort of seeing that as weapons, tranches of weapons are sent to Ukraine, right? He sort of was remarking about how the Russians were yet again kind of gnashing their teeth about this and creating a big stir and really saying, how much of an escalation this was. And it sort of started to remind me how they've essentially, the Russians have done this at every step of this process, from javelins to in-laws to armored personnel vehicles and all kinds of things, right? Every time something gets sent, I think even down to like helmets and tents, it's like, this is a huge violation and will detonate Russian and German relations forever, or totally change Russian-U.S. relations, and constantly using the diplomatic bullhorn to try to signal to, I think, sympathetic people in the West that this is somehow, crossing a red line that wouldn't have already been crossed, right? Essentially playing into this, please appease us kind of narrative. And it's really interesting because, the first time what it reminded me of actually was when I first went to China in 2007. I had been reading about Taiwan and the People's Republic of China and the history of that divorce, and in the 50s and 60s, when the communists, the Maoists, drove the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek out of eastern China to the island of Formosa, and the Kuomintang there set up the Republic of China with Taiwan. We being the United States, pretty quickly said, okay, this is the status quo, right? The PRC, you won't, invade this country. You're going to leave our allies alone and not invade Taiwan. And we're going to demonstrate our desire for you to not do that by flying pretty consistently, flying sorties of fighter aircraft and interceptors over the South China Sea to prevent you from getting any big ideas, right? And letting you know that if you try to do this, you will be stopped from the air. And at the time, the Chinese, the People's Republic of China, would issue these final warnings to the United States. And this was a very tense period of Sino-U.S. relations and quite a bit of brinksmanship. And for some amount of time in the 50s, it was quite a maybe as there is today, although I think more seriously then, sort of an expectation that the Chinese would try to invade. And it actually became, as I learned when I was preparing to go on this trip to China for the first time, it became quite a joke in what was in the Soviet Union, as there were, at the time, a lot of the satire in the Soviet Union sort of took the form of these, you could think about them almost as memes, right? These Soviet jokes about bureaucracy and about inefficiency and sort of the irrationality of these planned systems, these highly planned systems and economies and bureaucracies. And I think some of these jokes in the Soviet Union also ended up kind of focusing on the inherent kind of farcical irrationality of the messaging of these regimes. And in this case, the joke was really, hey, how many final warnings can you issue? Because I think China, the People's Republic of China, ended up issuing, I want to say, over 900 of these quote unquote final warnings, right? This became kind of a bit, right, in the Soviet Union. And it's really interesting, as we sit here now and look at the sort of successor in many ways to the Soviet Union in the Russian Federation, basically doing a very similar thing, where it's like, this is the final warning about this tranche of weapons or this tranche of money or whatever it might be. But of course, from the perspective of the free world, or an open society, maybe more accurately, we look at this and sort of say this is deeply irrational to the point of being meaningless, right? You can't keep saying this is the final warning, because that makes it lose all meaning, right? It's sort of it loses any traction at that point. And I think on our end, there's this sort of implicit analysis that follows that says, well, how long can they possibly continue to issue these final warnings? At some point, it just breaks down, right? And what's interesting about that is, I think from the perspective, it's part of this paradox of authoritarianism, right? That because there's no contestation of the discourse in the narrative, right? In the media, in the mass media, in these authoritarian regimes like the Russian Federation currently is, where there's comparatively very little contestation, and conducting that contestation of narrative, speaking truth to power, so to speak, is extremely dangerous. What you see is it's actually not, there is no one to hold this regime to account, right? It doesn't really work the same way that it would in Germany or the United Kingdom or Japan or New Zealand or the United States, where at some point if you say something enough and don't follow up on it, you lose political power. There's a risk in sort of you can almost think about it as like inflation, but applied to discourse, political soft power and discourse, right? You can't just keep saying the same thing with no results, because eventually people won't believe you, and you look weak, right? That bill coming due doesn't necessarily happen to the Saddam Husseins of the world or the Putins of the world, because there isn't that contestation of the political discourse. At the same time, because the legitimacy of the regime, and this is the paradox, right, is on the one hand you have this strength of being able to say what you can lie as much as you want. It almost gives you power, because even the people that realize that you're lying realize that you have the power to lie, and no one can stop you, right? And so that's this sort of like post-truth power that a Putin can have. Is like, it doesn't even matter. The people that the people that are dumb enough to believe me will believe me, and that's most people. And if you're smart enough to see through it, well, you're also smart enough to see that I can do whatever I want. So congratulations, you've seen the man behind the curtain, and you can't do anything about it, right? And that when you first encounter this phenomenon, it's like, well, that's really a scary amount of power for these kinds of regimes to have, and it is. But at the same time, because the ideological mandate for something like the Putin regime, right, or more broadly, you think about a lot of authoritarian regimes, China, the PRC comes to mind here. The mandate really is very much based in strength. It's very much, especially in the Russian case, based in sort of a kind of basal masculinity, right? As the West is effete, and there's feminism, and there's LGBT, equality, and there's all of these things that, in the mind of a certain type of chauvinist on this authoritarian regime's part, would think of these things as diversity as weakness kind of ideas, right? And obviously, I think most of us would find that to be a very problematic approach, and maybe would even see it very much as the opposite to be true. But for a regime like Putin's, it's like we've got the strong guy. He's shirtless on a horse. We can invade and take back whatever we want, right? There's very much an ideology based in strength, and sort of a claim of masculinity and aggressiveness and a tradition. And this is the paradox, because that is also something that necessitates a response. They can't avoid responding. They have to respond. they have to generate a counter narrative and say, this is the final straw, right? And I think what eventually does happen there is you start to lose sense of what actually the goal is, right? Like in the case of China's final warning in the Taiwan Strait, Taiwan is still a country, ostensibly, right? I mean, there's debate about how that's defined, but it's certainly not politically controlled from Beijing. And at the end of the day, the United States, did achieve its goals there, and these sort of empty threats, there is a lack of traction with reality here, right? You can continue to spoon feed this narrative domestically because there's no one to call you on it. At the same time, in the realpolitik of international relations, that just because you can say those things and get away with that domestically doesn't mean that it's actually true. And I think that's what you're seeing here kind of play out in Ukraine. Is it's not actually true that this is the final straw. And from an objective perspective, what Russia's continued warnings about these weapons and financial aid packages, and what these saber rattling final warnings really indicate is, yeah, you can have this control domestically, but you're also not getting your way internationally, and it doesn't actually matter. It's not stopping anything. So that's really what I wanted to kind of get across, was sort of this paradox and thinking about sort of the historical echoes of these sort of these final warnings and why we should interrogate them and think about them critically before we accept, I think, some of the more extremist or alarmist views of this relationship. It actually, in many ways, indicates really a lack of power to do anything on the part of Russia, and not so much, that they have power over this. So, look forward to your comments in the video here, and thanks for watching.